Could you briefly introduce yourself, your role, and your discipline?
Yes, my name is Mark Pickering. I'm a lecturer in anatomy in the School of Medicine. My major focus and most of my teaching is around the topic of neuroanatomy, so the anatomy of the brain and the nervous system, and sort of structure and function of the brain and nervous system in health and in disease. So primarily, I'm teaching medicine students, and we have two cohorts of medicine students. We have our undergraduate cohort, who are mostly coming directly in from the leaving certificate or the international equivalents thereof. And we also have a second cohort of medicine students who are our graduate entry medicine students. So these are students who have previously completed degrees in bachelor's degrees in other subjects, some of them related to medicine, some of them completely unrelated, completely different, who are coming back to do a second qualification in medicine. So two quite different, they need to learn the same things, but two sets of students with very different backgrounds.
That's great. Thank you for letting me know that. That gives me a good sense of your background. Could you tell me about the module or modules you teach at the collaborative learning elements they include?
Yes, so there's two modules that I teach on, and I teach mostly the same content on both. One of them I coordinate, and one of them a colleague, Tom Flanagan, coordinates. And this is basically one module is delivered to our undergraduate entry students, and the other one to our graduate entry students. So again, it's the same thing, but we kind of do it twice, and we do it one in the autumn, and we do one in the spring. So one of the nice things we have is we get to sort of iterate this program twice a year. Neuroscience is a notoriously challenging subject for medicine students specifically. And there's a well-established, sort of globally established phenomenon called neurophobia, where medicine students just find the nervous system difficult and challenging. So across these two modules, myself and Tom have over the years tried to develop sort of creative and sort of new approaches to kind of not just help students to learn the content, but to help them become more confident in their own abilities. Because there isn't really anything inherently difficult about it compared to other topics. One of the big barriers is students' perception of it. So they have a fear of it, right? They come in, they expect it to be hard. And if we don't help them, they're going to find it harder than they really need to. So that's kind of one of the things that we've been doing. So what we've tried to do over the years is, so we deal with anatomy, and anatomy is fundamentally three-dimensional. And the very traditional approaches to teaching this. So some of what we do involves actual real human anatomy. And this is happening in our dissection rooms, in our anatomy lab, and students actually get to experience and get hands-on with real human anatomy. But this is always going to be limited. There's only so much you can do with this. And the other elements of it, are very difficult to do with sort of, a traditional textbook diagram or images or even videos on a screen in a lecture theater. So I've been trying to come up with new ways of doing this. And one of the things that we, several years ago, we introduced a program during the summer where we had students who came in, and a small number of students would come in and actually use 3D printing to generate teaching models that we'd be able to use. And what one of the most interesting things that ever happened was, so this was students who came in, they didn't really know much about 3D printing. So they would work with me or my colleagues, and we would sort of teach them about the basics of 3D design and 3D printing and help them with the technical aspects. And they would sort of bring their own kind of knowledge as learners to the process. And something that I probably hadn't anticipated was really the power of their perspective. So what became really interesting was, and there was one conversation I had with one of our students who did this, and she made this fantastic model. It was of a particularly difficult circuit within the brain. It doesn't really matter what it is, but I was really impressed by how she'd kind of put it together. And I remember saying to her, like, why did you decide to do it like this? And what she said was, I found this really hard when I was learning it. So I wanted to make the model that I wished I had when I was learning it. And this was really solid evidence in my mind that, the insights that learners had to their needs far exceeded what we had. So I was like, this is great. And I started to realize that we designed this program initially so students could help us generate models that we could use for other students. But I started to realize that actually the students, by going through the process, were benefiting. So now we're dealing with very large student numbers, classes of 100 or 200, depending on which of our medicine classes we're talking about. We realistically can't get them all to make a 3D model and 3D print it and design it and so on. But what we realized is we wanted to actually integrate this idea of making a model into our program. So that's what we did, and we did it in both the undergraduate neuroscience module and the graduate entry neurology module. And what we now do is, and have been doing, and will be doing, I've done this year and are going to be doing it from next week on, is inviting students to, as part of this module, they will work in teams and they go away, and instead of using 3D printing or something kind of sophisticated like that, because the end point, the model at the end isn't necessarily the important thing, it's the experience of creating it. So we get them to use just household items, right? Toys and themselves or anything they can find, and create a model of anything to help explain anything that they've encountered in this module. And then they submit that sort of as a video. So they create a video of this model, demonstrating this model, and they submit that. And they work as groups. And not everybody loves it, right? And that's okay, right? Because this is only one part of a module. But we're trying to diversify. We're trying to have as many different ways to engage with the content as possible. But what we found is that most of the students really like this. And they like it because, not just because of the kind of how it helps them learn, but how it helps them work together, how it helps them be creative. The entire process is fundamentally creative. And it's also quite playful. It's just, and I think, personally, I think play is a really important thing. I think play is essentially how we explore and how we learn. We do it instinctively as kids. A lot of us grow out of it as we get older. Like some, like myself, don't really. I'm just a big overgrown child anyway. But giving students a space and permission to play, I think, is really useful. So what I think is the interesting aspect of what we've done is we've told them to, when they're creating these models, to create them as teaching resources. So I think this is really interesting because they're trying to create them for each other and for themselves, right? So what would help you? Find something in this topic. Maybe it's like how vision works. Something in that topic you find tricky, and try and make something that makes it easy to explain that to your classmates. And I think this really helps with a sense of empathy. So one of the most sort of driving principles behind my sort of teaching philosophy is that all education is a partnership and is a collaboration. All learning, the entire process is a collaboration. And this means that we have to collaborate with the students, but the students also have to collaborate with us. And I think there's often a sense amongst students that their time here in university as learners, they're kind of in confrontation with us because we're educators, but sometimes we can mostly seem like examiners. And the examination and the assessment process feels combative. And it's really hard to dissuade students of that. And I can tell them that, like, I'm not here to judge them. I'm here to support them through their learning. And assessment's a really important part to drive learning, right? But it's not the purpose. The purpose is the learning. The assessment just drives it. And I think this helps them because, it's really obvious, I think, for educators to try and put themselves in the shoes of learners. It's less obvious to try get learners to put themselves in the shoes of educators, but I think they benefit from that. So this kind of helps that kind of collaborative process. So how we've been doing this so far is we basically send students away to work in their own time and sort this out amongst themselves. I think what would be much better to do this, to a much better way to do this would be to have a place where we could all do it together. So what I would ideally like for this is if we had a place where we had, basic resources. And I mean things like Play-Doh and Lego and, silly things like that, right? The sort of things that you would give preschool kids to play with. Let's give them to medicine students and let them kind of in real time work together. And what that would allow us to do is to give them active feedback during the process and support during the process. Because right now, they have an opportunity to submit sort of written proposal that here's what we want to do, and then we give them feedback. But it's a one-shot thing, and it'd be much more efficient if we could do that, and much more useful to the students if we could do that as a dialogue. And I think it would also reinforce the idea that this is a partnership, that this is a collaboration, and that we're all kind of working towards the same goal.
My God, that sounds so interesting. I love your approach. And this is the reason I love hearing about various models, how they foster collaborative learning. I mean, it's such a vital part of student engagement. That was so
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah.
And what type of group work do you use? Is it like problem-based or case-based, like, or inquiry-based, team-based learning? What is it?
So I don't know. We haven't really thought it through that much. So I think it's more. I think one of the key focuses is on it's kind of skills based, right? Because it's all really about communication, right? And I think it's rather than it being we don't give them a specific problem, right? We don't give them, and there isn't really necessarily any inquiry involved. This is information that they're getting elsewhere in the module, right? And we're assuming that they integrate it, and traditionally we assess that in an exam at the end. But what we want to do now is sort of get them to tell us along the way, but do it through kind of creative communication. And that's really the sort of, and I think when we give them something like, I mean, the reason why we do things like encourage them to just use household items and basic things is because it forces them to think in an abstract way, right? So they need to take their ideas and work out how to present them, how to represent them. And that, in order to do that, there's an easy tendency to, like, if we just gave them to, if we asked them to give, let's say, a presentation on, the neuroanatomy of the visual system, they would do, and they'd probably do a great job of it, and they would depend very heavily on technical terminology. And they need to know technical terminology, but we assess that in an exam. This is only one part of the module. It's not the only way we assess it, but we're already assessing their technical knowledge, but we're not really assessing their communication skills. And these are people who want to be doctors. So they're going to need to communicate with colleagues in other doctors, other healthcare professionals who should, and they communicate with them through that technical language. But they're also going to have to communicate with patients, families, and they're not all necessarily going to have that basis of technical knowledge, but they will have an investment in the information that they're trying to get across. So that's kind of why we try to encourage them to take that approach, to take that kind of, we place a restriction, don't use textbook diagrams, right? Simplify things down, make it a little bit abstract, and that makes them think creatively. And I think, and it's a basic approach. We've done it with students. We've also expanded this out and done it with other groups. A few years ago, we ran a single workshop at a science communication event where we had, journalists and science communication professionals and people from funding agencies, and we got them to do the same thing. And it is that thing of taking an idea, and a complex idea, and forcing yourself to really kind of probe your understanding of it in order to be able to express it in simple terms, which, to be fair, is what we do as educators, right? So, I'm a neuroscientist. I, I do have a good understanding of how the nervous system works. And my job as an educator is to basically convey that understanding to people who are starting off with a lower level of knowledge and understanding. So what I have to do as an educator is work out the correct level of abstraction. And I've increased my understanding through that process. It'd be really nice to let students do the same thing.
That's so great. I mean, I love the fact that you said that it's like a skill-based approach that's
Mm.
so unique and that's so useful. I am actually very curious to know that do you incorporate peer learning activities? You have told me so many activities that you conduct. So does this have like a pair work or peer review also?
We do have peer assessment. So what will happen is we use, and we've used a couple of different sort of peer assessment tools over the years. But what we've done is we've tended to, so the students will submit the work, and us involved in the module will give a grade. Um, the students will also submit their kind of assessment of each other within their peer group. And we use those to sort of modulate their individual grades, right? So, for example, if we assigned a grade of an A minus to an assignment, and every student in the group said every other student in the group was absolutely fantastic and outstanding, they all get an A minus.
Ah,
And if every student in the group said every other student in the group was absolutely terrible and did nothing, because they all did the same amount of nothing, they all get an A minus. But if cumulatively through this process, they go, well, these people did a little bit better than everyone else, and these people did a little bit worse, and this is how it all aggregated out, then they get, it might elevate some a little bit and bring others down a little bit. So people can kind of, they feel an investment of their work into the process. We've done this with some of our students. In other cases, we haven't. And it's always a tricky thing, right? Because some students are a little resistant to the idea um, that they have to take responsibility for each other, and it can put a little bit of additional pressure on them. But we've always tried to frame it in a positive light. So the students will give a kind of a rating to each other, but they also have to leave written comments and written feedback, which they know the other students will see. And we've always told them, like, this needs to be positive and constructive. Like, even if you feel somebody didn't do as well or as they could have, you need to frame that in a positive way. How can they learn from that? Which again is what we try to do when we give feedback. And again, it's about putting them in our shoes and helping them understand, which hopefully helps them. It's a positive experience, but also hopefully it helps them kind of afterwards understanding our feedback. If they've
mhm.
if they've understood, the feedback that they give, and they see feedback that we give, they'll understand how that works a little bit better.
That's a very good way to encourage student engagement, I think. I feel peer learning can really help develop students' critical skills and collaboration skills, and you're
Mm.
doing it in a very good way. So, in between this process, did you feel that active and collaborative learning had impacted positively or negatively on your student learning, or in other ways? If so, how?
Well, I think it did, and I think one of the things that it really helps with, I think, is the kind of the social element. We deal with a very diverse set of students. They're very international, and and this means that they're coming from different cultural backgrounds, but also different language backgrounds. And we always completely mix our groups up, right? So it really kind of it there's a natural tendency, I think, in a very large set of students for people to kind of gravitate towards their own, for want of a better phrase. And this might be just as simple as like, these are the people whose language I understand the best. And that's entirely natural and completely healthy. But the problem is sometimes they can miss out on that interactions with other groups within the class. So by essentially enforcing that interaction, I think that helps kind of expand their social horizons within their group, and they're going to be mixed and interchanged throughout the rest of their career. They're going to go out to hospitals. They're going to have to get used to doing this, so it helps with that sort of social element. In terms of driving their learning, it's hard to say exactly, because I mean, the grades, the standards in the modules are fairly consistent. So it hasn't had a huge impact, I don't think, necessarily in that regard. But in terms of the feedback that we get from the students, their perceptions of the modules and the topic itself seems to have improved. So, I mentioned this concept of neurophobia, and I think they're coming out of the module less terrified of the nervous system, because they've had a little bit more fun than they would have expected. And I think that fun element is it's not trivial. It's easy to forget that. It's easy to dismiss things that are fun as, it's less important, but it drives engagement, right? If something is fun, people will want to do it. But it's also not a bad thing. It's a good thing to have fun doing something. Just back to my kind of point about like the importance of play. Play should be fun. If it's not fun, you're not doing it right.
Absolutely. That's an extremely insightful perspective. I find it really fascinating, and I love the play-based learning approach.
Mm.
That's really cool. I think your teaching method really influences your students and the overall, learning environment that you have in your class. And that makes me think that did you have any active and collaborative learning activities that worked really well in your experience?
Um, well, I think in I think that's in, I think that are kind of these kind of video projects, these little model projects work quite well. The other thing that I thought worked, and again, this was a kind of gave me some sort of insight into kind of the importance of this. And it was something that we did during COVID when we had to teach online. And one of the things that happened, I happened to do when we all had to teach online, during that first summer, I actually did a professional diploma program, and I was learning online, and I was a student for a while, and online learning was terrible. And I realized that we could not do this the way we'd always been doing it. It was absolutely awful. And the other thing that came up, there was really interesting survey data of students in that very early stage of COVID about like how it impacted them. And the one thing that really stood out to me was the social isolation, right? It was students who were like stuck at home, not seeing anybody. And the social aspect of learning, right? Now, when you have people actively collaborating together, that's really obvious. The social aspect is there. But even if you just have a lecture, right? And you just have a big room with hundreds of people, they're chatting to each other, they're interacting beforehand and afterwards, sometimes during. But that social element is hugely important, and that was missing. So when we came to design how we were going to teach during COVID, we realized we had to do everything as kind of collaborative work, as kind of interactive work, and as group-based work. And there are ways to do that online. And it was very task-based. And what we did was we gave them lots of short tasks. So we would take that 50-minute slot that we had in the timetable, and instead of me just streaming a lecture over Zoom and talking at them for 50 minutes, we would get them together and we'd go, here's a job, right? And we would give them a task, and we would send them off into a group for 10, and we'll report back in 10 minutes. And it was very simple and it was discrete. And then we would give them something else. And the actual, I guess, lecture content was delivered in a series of short videos that they could consume at their own pace. And they were kind of told, okay, before this session, make sure you watch these. And then they would come in. And it was all very short, kind of active. And that kind of, when you make it short, make it small, make it digestible, it's easy for them to focus on it. They work together as a group and then it's done. And then they can move on and do the next one. So what I think works well is rather than kind of going, spend the next hour all working together on this, if you go, here's a very discrete task, spend 10 minutes on it, and then move on to the next. So even and make it as interactive and as focused on the students as possible and collaborative as possible. And one of my favorite ones was, I mean, it's a very simple, basic thing that, you know, is kind of a staple of sort of neuroanatomy and in a medical context is there's a damage to a part of the brain, or you have someone, they have this symptom, whatever it happens to be, which part of their brain is injured? Or if you damage this part of the brain, how will this patient be affected? So what we did was we gave students essentially a diagram of the brain, and we told them, put 3 marks on it, and then that's going to be passed on to the next group. And they're going to have to work out how that will impact them. But you're going to get the ones from the group on the other side. And we did that online. And since we stopped teaching online, we've kind of lost some of those elements. Because what that needs is space, right? And if you have a space where you can assemble students into groups, have them scribbling these out on pieces of paper and then passing it between groups, it's both active, it's an active process, it's collaborative, and it's collaborative at both ends, right? Because they need to decide how hard are they going to make it for the people next to them, right? Because some of them are really easy and some of them are really tricky, right? And then they need to, you know, deal with whatever gets sent their way. So just little tasks like that, I think would work really well, but it needs the resource, right? It needs space, and it needs flexible space. It needs the sort of like rooms and tables that can be used in as many different ways as possible. I think that's one of the key things that will allow you to do that. Right now, we don't have the space available to do that for very large groups of students.
That's wonderful to hear. I mean, I'm glad that worked out well for you. And I think you found some pretty effective ways to enhance student participation. So, were there like any tools or platforms or resources that you think could enhance the teaching and learning experience in an active and learning space?
Um, I don't think it needs, I mean, I think the most important things in a space is the space. And it's like, it's the flexibility, and it's, you know, it's amazing what you can do with just tables and chairs and paper, right? You don't need a huge amount. You don't need sophisticated technology. You don't need, you know, I have some very young kids in primary school, and when they started in primary school, I was amazed at how different primary schools are now to when I was in primary school. Right? I'm, you know, a middle-aged man, and when I was in primary school, we all sat in little chairs that all pointed up directly at the teacher, and that's not what it looks like anymore. And everybody sits around a table, and you know they move. You know, there's no central focus point. They're focused on each other, and they're working together, and they have simple resources, right? It's like it's Play-Doh, it's paper, it's, you know, all of these sorts of things. And this works so well as a sort of an active learning environment, right? Because they can collaborate, it is flexible, they can move between groups, they can discuss within their group, they can discuss with their neighbors, they can engage in so many different ways. And they've worked that out in primary schools. I'm like, we need to look at what works for 6-year-olds. Right? Because it's going to work. It's going to work for people in their 20s. And I think that's where we need to, if we want the model, right? That's the model. It's primary school. Because
Right.
it works so well.
That sounds like a great recommendation. We should have that. So, what advice would you give to the future staff teaching in active and learning environments?
Um, I would say don't be afraid to sort of experiment a little bit and kind of try things out with students, but be absolutely open with them when you're doing that. If you're doing something for the first time, tell students you're doing it for the first time, and it brings them into the process, right? We're all experimenting together. And I think we have to keep trying new things and keep modifying and keep tweaking. Um, but I think students are part of that process. So if you're designing activities, if you're designing sort of new ways of teaching, um, be be experimental and take risks, but be open and honest about it. Because I think when you're open and honest with students about where you are in the process, it just helps build that empathy. It helps build that sort of like, we're all in this process together. We all want the same thing. We all want students to learn. We want them to develop skills. We want them to develop their sort of as individuals. We want them to grow as individuals. Students want that, and we want that, and we're all part of the same team. And I think being open and honest is really important.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing those insights. They were
Thank you very
so,
much.
so good.
Yeah.